My name is Sister Louise McDonald. I'm a sister of St. Joseph of Carondelet, living in Seattle. And this summer I had the opportunity to join several hundred other of our sisters in St. Louis, where we celebrated 175 years from our arrival in the United States from France. So the focus of our meetings was on immigration. And they asked this, prior to that meeting, they asked the sisters who had personal stories to share them. And so I want to share with you today what I shared with our sisters back in St. Louis. And I call it Maria's story. It's actually a story of two different beautiful women named Maria, but I put the two together so it's a compilation that represents many, many, many women, men, and children who fled for their lives from El Salvador and Guatemala during the civil wars in the 1980s. Maria and I first met in the 1980s at a house where she was staying in San Diego County. Through a translator, I learned that she had crossed the U.S.-Mexico border on foot with her 7 children. At that time, there was a civil war raging in her home country. The Salvadoran military was targeting poor people, especially church workers. Maria's husband, who was a catechist, had been abducted from their home in the middle of the night by men wearing military uniforms, and he simply disappeared. The next day, when Maria went to the jail looking for him, she was arrested and imprisoned, along with her preschool-aged children, including an infant she was nursing. The rest of her children were cared for by the other villagers. The jail conditions were harsh, with no heat nor even any blankets. The meager food rations were doled out only to those who had their own bowls. So Maria's neighbors brought bowls and blankets for her and her children. And Maria nestled her baby between her breasts to keep him warm during the cold nights. On a sunny day, not long afterwards, she was blindfolded, led outdoors, tied to a tree, and interrogated by armed guards about her husband and other villagers and the local church. They threatened to kill her children in front of her. She told them what she thought they wanted to hear, but they were not satisfied. So she was subjected to a mock execution of guns firing blanks against her head. She fainted, but when she regained consciousness, she was back in her cell. Maria never told me the rest of the story about how she was freed and made her way to California, accompanied by 2 much younger women and all of her children. At that time, I was privileged to be a co-founder of the local sanctuary movement for Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees, and Maria was in one of our safe houses. The U.S. government did not recognize them as refugees with, quote, a well-founded fear of persecution, unquote, which would have qualified them for first asylum status under a United Nations treaty that the United States had signed. For to do so would have meant acknowledging the human rights violations of the Salvadoran government, which the U.S. government was supporting with funds, helicopters, weapons, and training. The Salvadoran government considered church workers to be, quote-unquote, communists, and therefore enemies of the state. So the mostly faith-based sanctuary movement arose to protect these refugees from being arrested as only, quote-unquote, illegal aliens, which the government feels are economic migrants looking for work, and to protect them from being deported back to their countries of origin. The ACLU had documented cases of Salvadoran deportees being executed some upon their arrival back at the airport in San Salvador. Anyone who was assisted in any way with food, shelter, transportation, communication, or concealment was therefore, according to federal officials, committing a felony punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment for each act of assistance, and up to 10 years for conspiring to do so. Many hundreds of church people were willing to risk this to save the lives of the Central American refugees. Certainly, Maria lived in fear of what would happen to her and her children if they were deported back to El Salvador. Whenever I drove them in my car and children heard a siren or a helicopter, they would dive to the floor and cover their heads with their arms and scream in terror. Clearly, they had been traumatized by war. With the help of some local Quakers and Protestants, we were able to transport Maria and her children to a Protestant church in Los Angeles, the next step on the Underground Railroad. Before leaving San Diego, we had received assurance from the pastor of a Protestant church in Seattle, Washington, that they would provide sanctuary and then safe passage to Canada, which would allow Maria's family to stay as permanent refugees. The church in Los Angeles assisted them to get to Seattle. About 10 years later, after I had moved to Seattle, I was invited to a sanctuary reunion in that church, and Maria and her family were there from Canada. We delighted in being reunited and seeing how her children had grown. They were all thriving in Canada and had obtained the necessary documents to allow them to safely cross the U.S.-Canada border without fear of deportation back to El Salvador. Although I never learned much Spanish, Maria and I had no trouble communicating heart to heart. I regret that these Salvadorans and Guatemalans could not live safely in the United States. With their courageous faith and admirable work ethic, they would have been assets to our country for generations to come. But I'm honored to have been called to this ministry among our dear neighbors. And I'm grateful to the new sanctuary movement in Washington State, particularly in Seattle, where I still live, for what they're doing for the current situation. Thank you.